The bells of St. Margaret's chimed 5 times across the misty London morning, their bronze voices carrying through the September fog of 1905. Professor Edmund Whitmore stirred in his narrow bed at Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house on Grosvenor Street, the familiar sound pulling him gently from dreams into the cool reality of another autumn day. The floorboards beneath his feet were cold as he swung his legs from beneath the wool blankets, their ancient wood creaking with the predictable complaint that had become part of his morning symphony. The chill of the room immediately embraced him, for Mrs. Pemberton, good Christian woman though she was, did not light the fires in the boarding-house rooms until 6 o'clock sharp. Edmund reached for his dressing gown, a worn but serviceable garment of burgundy wool that had seen him through his years at Cambridge and now served him faithfully in his position at the Royal Academy. The wash-basin in the corner held water from the previous evening, a thin film of ice just beginning to form across its surface. Edmund broke it with his fingers, the sharp cold sending a shiver through his arm as he splashed the bracing water across his face. This daily ritual of cold water was, he believed, beneficial to both constitution and character. As a lecturer in temperance, he held firm to the belief that small daily disciplines built the foundation for greater moral strength. Through the lace curtains at his window, London was beginning its slow awakening. The gas lamps along the street still burned, their yellow light growing paler as dawn approached. A few early risers moved through the fog like shadows, a milk cart rattling over the cobblestones, its bottles clinking musically, a charwoman hurrying to her morning employment, her shawl pulled tight against the damp air. Edmund dressed methodically in the semi-darkness. First, the cotton combinations that provided a barrier against the perpetual dampness of London autumn. Then the starched white shirt, its collar standing stiff and proper, though the edges were beginning to show the faint yellow of age despite Mrs. Pemberton's best efforts with the washing glue. His trousers were pressed with the careful attention he gave to all aspects of his appearance, dark wool, respectable if not fashionable, hanging just so over his well-polished boots. The process of tying his necktie was a meditation in itself. The dark blue silk, a gift from his sister upon his appointment to the Royal Academy, required precise attention to achieve the proper knot. As his fingers worked the familiar motions, Edmund's mind turned to the day ahead. 3 lectures to deliver, each one an opportunity to plant seeds of temperance in young minds. The morning would bring his first-year students, eager and uncertain in equal measure. The afternoon held his advanced seminar, where the discussions could delve deeper into the philosophical and moral arguments that formed the backbone of the temperance movement. His stomach reminded him quietly that it had been many hours since his modest supper of bread and cheese the previous evening. The boarding house would not serve breakfast for another hour, but Edmund had learned to manage these small hungers. They were, he reasoned, another form of discipline, another way to master the body's demands. He kept a small tin of biscuits in his desk drawer at the Academy, plain, dry things that would sustain him through the morning if necessary. The wardrobe mirror, spotted with age and slightly warped, reflected back the image of a man who had learned to make respectability from modest means. His dark jacket, while carefully maintained, showed the slight shine at the elbows that came from years of use. His scholarly appearance was completed by the addition of his spectacles, wire-rimmed and perpetually in need of cleaning, which he polished now with his handkerchief until they gleamed satisfactorily. Edmund gathered his necessities for the day. His leather satchel, soft with age and use, held his lecture notes written in his precise hand. Each page was numbered and organized with the methodical care that characterized everything he did. Today's lectures on the physiological effects of alcohol on the human system were supplemented with carefully drawn diagrams he had copied from medical texts in the Academy Library. His students, he knew, responded well to visual demonstrations of the damage that alcohol wreaked upon the body's organs. Before leaving his room, Edmund paused for his morning prayer, kneeling beside his bed on the small rug his mother had hooked for him years ago. The wool was rough beneath his knees, a sensation that helped focus his mind on the divine rather than the temporal. He prayed for strength to face the day's challenges, for wisdom in his teaching, and for the souls of those still trapped in the bondage of drink. He prayed, too, for his colleagues at the academy, many of whom viewed his temperance work with barely concealed amusement or, worse, open hostility. The boarding-house stairs creaked beneath his feet as he descended, each step a familiar note in the morning's routine. Mrs. Pemberton was already stirring in the kitchen, the sound of pots and the smell of coal smoke drifting through the hallway. She emerged as he reached the front door, wiping her hands on her apron, her gray hair already pinned in its severe bun despite the early hour. "Off already, Professor Whitmore?" she asked, though she knew well his habits after 3 years of his residence. "Won't you wait for a proper breakfast? There's porridge coming, and I've got some nice kippers from the fishmonger." "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton, but I must prepare for my morning lecture," Edmund replied, tipping his hat politely. "The work of education waits for no man's appetite." She shook her head, a gesture somewhere between admiration and exasperation. "You'll waste away to nothing, Professor. A man needs proper sustenance, especially one who speaks as much as you do. The body requires surprisingly little when the mind is properly engaged," he responded with a gentle smile. "And I find the morning walk clears my thoughts wonderfully for the day's work." The London air that greeted him as he stepped onto the street was thick with the familiar cocktail of coal smoke, horse dung, and the underlying dampness that never quite left the city even in the driest months. The fog wrapped around him like a living thing, muffling sounds and softening the harsh edges of the buildings into something almost dreamlike. Edmund pulled his coat closer and began his walk toward the academy, his boots clicking rhythmically on the wet pavement. The route from Grosvenor Street to the Royal Academy took him through the awakening heart of London. Shop owners were beginning to open their establishments, rolling up shutters with loud rattling sounds that echoed in the foggy air. The sweep boys were already at work, their small forms darting through the streets with their brushes and equipment, faces already blackened with soot despite the early hour. Edmund always felt a pang of sympathy for these children, many of whom, he knew, were given gin to help them bear the harsh conditions of their work. It was one of the many cruelties that the temperance movement sought to address. As he passed the public house on the corner of Bedford Square, Edmund noticed several men already gathered outside, waiting for the doors to open. Their faces bore the telltale signs of chronic drink, the reddened noses, the rheumy eyes, the slight tremor in hands that reached reflexively for pockets containing the few coins that would buy their morning relief. These were the casualties of society's acceptance of alcohol, the living examples he sometimes wished he could bring into his lecture hall to show his students the true cost of intemperance. But such thoughts were uncharitable, he reminded himself. These men were victims, not villains. They deserved compassion, not judgment. It was the system that failed them, the society that normalized and even celebrated the consumption of alcohol while turning a blind eye to its devastating consequences. The Royal Academy of Moral Sciences and Letters stood like a bastion of Victorian respectability on Russell Square, its neo-Gothic facade rising from the surrounding buildings with an air of scholarly authority. Edmund paused at the iron gates, as he did each morning, to appreciate the institution that had become his professional home. The building's red brick was darkened with soot, giving it a gravitas that seemed appropriate for an institution dedicated to the moral and intellectual improvement of society. The porter, Mr. Jenkins, was already at his post, his brass buttons gleaming despite the dim morning light. He was a veteran of the Crimean War, and his military bearing had never left him despite the decades that had passed since his service. His greeting was always the same, a respectful nod and a gruff "morning, Professor Whitmore," but Edmund had learned to read the subtle variations in his tone that indicated the mood of the academy. This morning, there was a slight tension in Jenkins's voice, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. "The dean's been asking for you, sir," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Said you should report to his office when you arrive." Edmund felt his stomach tighten slightly. Dean Harrington's summons rarely boded well for the temperance program. The dean, while publicly supporting the Academy's mission of moral education, privately viewed Edmund's work as an embarrassment, a relic of an earlier, less sophisticated age. The fact that the temperance lectureship was endowed by the late Lady Worthington, whose generous bequests specifically required its continuation, was the only thing that prevented its elimination. "Thank you, Jenkins. I shall attend to it immediately after I've prepared my morning lecture," Edmund replied, maintaining his composure despite the anxiety beginning to gnaw at him. "Begging your pardon, sir, but he was quite specific," he said immediately upon your arrival. Edmund nodded, adjusting his satchel. The morning lecture would have to wait. He made his way through the Academy's hallowed halls, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. The portraits of former deans and distinguished professors gazed down from their gilt frames, their painted eyes seeming to follow his progress with stern judgment. The smell of beeswax and old books permeated the air, mixed with the faint aroma of pipe tobacco that clung to the fabric of the building despite official prohibitions against smoking in the public areas. The dean's office occupied a corner of the second floor, its windows overlooking the manicured gardens that were the pride of the Academy. Edmund knocked on the heavy oak door, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. "Enter," came the dean's voice, cultured and cold. Dean Harrington sat behind his massive mahogany desk, its surface covered with papers arranged with mathematical precision. He was a man who had cultivated his appearance to project academic authority, silver hair perfectly groomed, pince-nez balanced on an aquiline nose, morning coat impeccable. He did not look up immediately, a calculated gesture meant to establish dominance, Edmund knew. "Ah, Whitmore," the dean finally said, setting down his pen with deliberate care. "Good of you to come. Please, sit." Edmund took the offered chair, its leather creaking slightly under his weight. The office was warm, almost uncomfortably so, the fire in the grate burning despite the relatively mild morning. The dean, Edmund had observed, seemed to require tropical conditions to function properly. "I'll come directly to the point," the dean began, steepling his fingers in a gesture Edmund had come to recognize as a precursor to unpleasantness. "There have been complaints about your lectures." "Complaints, Dean Harrington?" Edmund kept his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. "Yes. Several members of the board have expressed concern that your enthusiasm for the temperance cause has begun to overshadow the academic rigor we expect from our faculty. There are reports that you've been distributing temperance literature to students, encouraging them to take pledges of abstinence." "I have made literature available to those who express interest," Edmund replied carefully. "But I have never required any student to take a pledge. That would be inappropriate and contrary to the principles of free thought we espouse here." The dean's lips thinned slightly. "Nevertheless, there is a perception that you are using your position to proselytize rather than educate. Lord Pemberton, you know him, I believe, his son is in your morning lecture, was quite upset to learn that young James had returned home from your class and emptied his father's wine cellar into the garden." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Edmund had to suppress a small smile at the image. Young James Pemberton was one of his most passionate converts to the temperance cause, his zeal sometimes exceeding his judgment. "I can hardly be held responsible for the actions students take outside the Academy," Edmund said. "If young Mr. Pemberton has come to see the dangers of alcohol through education and rational argument, surely that is evidence of successful teaching rather than inappropriate influence?" "Come now, Whitmore," the dean said, his tone becoming more conciliatory but no less firm. "We both know the realities of our situation. The Academy depends upon the goodwill and financial support of families like the Pembertons. We cannot afford to alienate them with what they perceive as radical ideologies. Temperance is hardly radical, Dean. It is supported by medical science, by moral philosophy, by the evidence of our own eyes when we see the devastation alcohol wreaks upon families and communities. Be that as it may, the Dean continued, I must ask you to moderate your approach. Teach the facts, by all means. Present the arguments. But this crusading spirit, this fervor, it must be curtailed. Do I make myself clear? Edmund felt the familiar weight of compromise pressing down upon him. How many times had he been asked to moderate, to temper, to dilute his message for the sake of social harmony? And yet, what choice did he have? Without his position at the Academy, his ability to influence young minds would be severely diminished. I understand your position, Dean Harrington, he said finally. I shall endeavor to present my materials in a manner that cannot be construed as inappropriate advocacy. Good man, the Dean said, his relief evident. I knew I could count on your discretion. After all, we must think of the greater good of the Academy. Your work is important, Whitmore, but it must not overshadow our broader mission. Edmund rose to leave, but the Dean's voice stopped him at the door. Oh, and Whitmore? The autumn fundraising gala is next month. I trust you'll attend? Lady Worthington's nephew will be there, and it would be good for him to see that our endowment continues to support appropriate scholarly work. The message was clear. Play the game, or risk losing everything. Edmund's lecture hall was on the third floor, a spacious room with tall windows that, on clear days, allowed natural light to flood the space. This morning, however, the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, reducing the outside world to a gray blur. The gas lamps had been lit, casting their warm but flickering light across the rows of wooden benches where his students would soon gather. He had 30 minutes before the lecture began, time he usually spent reviewing his notes and preparing his materials. But this morning, his mind kept returning to the Dean's warning. How could he teach the truth about alcohol's dangers without appearing to advocate for temperance? It was like being asked to teach mathematics without suggesting that students actually use numbers. The door creaked open, and Edmund looked up to see Thomas Ashford, one of his most dedicated students, entering with an armload of books. Thomas was a scholarship boy, his place at the Academy secured through brilliance rather than birthright, and he approached his studies with the intensity of someone who knew that education was his only path to a better life. Good morning, Professor Whitmore, Thomas said, his voice still carrying traces of his Yorkshire accent despite his efforts to adopt the received pronunciation expected at the Academy. I've been reading the medical texts you recommended. The evidence is overwhelming, sir. I don't understand how anyone can dispute the harm alcohol causes. Edmund smiled sadly. The truth, Mr. Ashford, often struggles against entrenched interests and social customs. Many people have significant financial investments in the alcohol trade. Others simply cannot imagine social interaction without the lubricant of drink. And then there are those who are already enslaved by alcohol and cannot bear to face the reality of their condition. But surely education can overcome ignorance, Thomas persisted, setting his books down with a thump that echoed in the empty hall. One would hope so, Edmund replied, beginning to arrange his lecture materials on the podium. But education requires willing pupils. Many people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. More students began to filter in as the bells chimed the hour. They were a diverse group, at least by the standards of the Academy, young men from various social strata, though all necessarily from families who could afford the fees or brilliant enough to earn scholarships. Edmund watched them take their seats, noting the social dynamics that played out in their positioning. The wealthy students, sons of lords and merchants, clustered together in the middle rows. The scholarship boys took seats at the edges, as if afraid to claim too much space. Among the entering students was James Pemberton, the young man whose wine-cellar emptying adventure had earned Edmund the dean's displeasure. James had the slightly soft look of a young man who had never known want, but his eyes held an intelligence and idealism that Edmund found encouraging. He took his usual seat in the front row, his notebook already open, pen poised to capture every word. "Gentlemen," Edmund began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall despite its soft tone. "Today we shall examine the physiological effects of alcohol upon the human system. This is not a matter of opinion or moral judgment, but of scientific fact, observable and measurable." He turned to the large anatomical chart he had hung behind the podium, pointing to the illustration of the human liver. "The liver, gentlemen, is our body's great chemical factory. It processes nutrients, manufactures proteins, and, crucially for our discussion, attempts to neutralize toxins. When alcohol enters the system, the liver must work to break it down, converting it first to acetaldehyde, a substance more toxic than alcohol itself, and then to acetic acid." A hand rose from the middle rows. Edmund recognized Frederick Worthington, nephew of his benefactress and a young man who made no secret of his enjoyment of the Academy's social drinking culture. "Yes, Mr. Worthington?" "Professor, surely the body would not process alcohol if it were truly poisonous. After all, fermentation is a natural process. One finds alcohol in overripe fruits that animals consume without apparent harm." It was a common argument, one Edmund had encountered countless times. "An excellent point, Mr. Worthington. You are correct that fermentation is natural. However, the concentration of alcohol in naturally fermented fruits is quite low, typically less than 1%. The beverages consumed in our society, wine, beer, spirits, contain far higher concentrations, achieved through human intervention. Moreover, the quantity consumed by humans far exceeds anything found in nature." He moved to the blackboard, taking up the chalk to draw a simple diagram. "Observe. When alcohol enters the bloodstream, it affects every organ it touches. The heart must pump harder to compensate for alcohol's effect on blood pressure. The brain's functions are impaired, beginning with judgment and inhibition, those very faculties that distinguish us from beasts." The scratch of pens on paper filled the room as students took notes. Edmund continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of long practice. "In the stomach, alcohol irritates the lining, leading to inflammation and, over time, ulceration. The kidneys must work harder to eliminate the toxins, leading to dehydration and strain on these vital organs." Another hand rose, this time from Thomas Ashford. "Professor, what are the claims that moderate consumption might have benefits? Some physicians prescribe alcohol for various ailments." Edmund nodded approvingly. "A crucial question, Mr. Ashford. It is true that some physicians prescribe alcohol, particularly as a sedative or to stimulate appetite. However, we must ask ourselves whether the temporary relief provided justifies the risk of dependence and long-term damage. Modern medicine is developing alternatives, laudanum for pain, though that carries its own risks, and various tonics for digestive complaints." He paused, aware that he was approaching dangerous territory. The dean's warning echoed in his mind. "I present these facts not to dictate your choices, gentlemen, but to ensure you make informed decisions. Knowledge is our greatest tool in navigating the complexities of modern life." The lecture continued for another 40 minutes, Edmund carefully walking the line between education and advocacy. He discussed the social costs of alcoholism, the broken families, the lost productivity, the burden on charitable institutions, while framing everything in terms of observable facts rather than moral imperatives. As the bells chimed the end of the hour, students began gathering their materials. James Pemberton lingered, approaching the podium with obvious nervousness. "Professor Whitmore," he began, his voice low, "I wanted to apologize if my actions at home have caused you any difficulty. Father was quite upset about the wine." Edmund looked at the young man with compassion. "Your actions are your own responsibility, Mr. Pemberton. I only hope that whatever decision you make regarding alcohol, it is based on careful thought rather than impulse. It was, sir. I've seen what drink does to people. My uncle, well, he's not the man he once was. And I've decided I don't want to risk becoming like him." "That is a mature decision," Edmund said carefully. "But remember, lasting change requires more than a single dramatic gesture. It requires daily commitment, especially when faced with social pressure." James nodded earnestly. "I understand, sir. That's why I've been attending the temperance meetings at the Methodist Chapel. They provide support and fellowship." Edmund felt both pride and concern. Pride that his teaching had inspired such conviction, concern that James's enthusiasm might further antagonize the dean and the board. The bells of St. Margaret's chimed noon as Edmund made his way to the Academy's modest library. This was his sanctuary, a place where he could find peace between lectures and escape the social dynamics that made the faculty common room uncomfortable. The library was not grand by London standards, the British Museum's reading room dwarfed it, but it contained a carefully curated collection of works on moral philosophy, social reform, and the sciences. The librarian, Miss Catherine Morgan, looked up from her cataloging as he entered. She was one of the few women employed by the Academy, her position secured through a combination of exceptional competence and the fact that her uncle sat on the Board of Governors. In her early 30s, unmarried, and possessed of a sharp intelligence that she was careful to modulate in mixed company, Miss Morgan had become something of an ally to Edmund in his increasingly isolated position. "Professor Whitmore," she greeted him with a slight smile. "I've set aside the medical journals you requested. They're on your usual table." "Thank you, Miss Morgan. Your efficiency is, as always, remarkable." Edmund made his way to the corner table he had claimed as his own through years of consistent use. The journals were indeed waiting recent issues of the Lancet and the British Medical Journal, along with several American publications that took a more progressive stance on the alcohol question. As he settled into his chair, the leather creaking familiarly beneath him, Edmund allowed himself a moment to simply exist in the peaceful atmosphere. Dust motes danced in the pale light from the tall windows, and the smell of old paper and binding glue created a cocoon of scholarly calm. Here, away from the politics and social pressures of the Academy, he could remember why he had chosen this path. His stomach reminded him again of his missed breakfast, a hollow ache that had become familiar over the years of disciplined self-denial. From his satchel, he retrieved the small tin of biscuits, hard, plain things that could survive indefinitely and provided basic sustenance without pleasure. As he ate one slowly, letting it soften slightly in his mouth before chewing, he opened the first journal. The article was on the treatment of delirium tremens, that terrible condition that befell chronic alcoholics when they attempted to stop drinking. The descriptions were clinical but horrifying: hallucinations, seizures, profound agitation that could last for days. Edmund had seen it himself during his volunteer work at the Temperance Hospital in Whitechapel, men strapped to beds to prevent them from harming themselves, their screams echoing through the wards. Heavy reading for the lunch hour, came a voice from behind him. Edmund turned to find Dr. Marcus Bellingham, professor of natural philosophy and one of the few faculty members who treated him with genuine respect rather than polite tolerance. Bellingham was a man of science through and through, his approach to life governed by empirical observation rather than social convention. "Research for my afternoon seminar," Edmund replied. the medical evidence against alcohol consumption continues to mount. Bellingham pulled out the adjacent chair, settling his considerable frame with a small grunt. I don't doubt it. I've been conducting some experiments myself on the effect of various substances on reaction time and cognitive function. Alcohol performs quite poorly, I must say. Yet you still partake at faculty dinners, Edmund observed, not unkindly. Moderately, yes, Bellingham admitted. Social lubrication, you might say. But I take your point. We are all hypocrites in our own ways, are we not? You rail against alcohol while consuming caffeine, which is itself a drug that affects consciousness. It was an old debate between them, comfortable in its familiarity. Tea, Edmund said, does not lead men to beat their wives or abandon their children. No, Bellingham agreed. Though the tea trade has its own moral complications, the conditions in the plantations, the opium trade that finances it. There is no pure consumption in our modern world, Whitmore. Everything is tainted by commerce and exploitation. Miss Morgan approached their table, moving with the quiet efficiency that characterized all her actions. Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt, but Professor Whitmore, there's a young woman at the desk asking for you. She says it's urgent. Edmund frowned. It was unusual for anyone to seek him out at the academy, particularly a woman. The institution's rules about female visitors were strict, designed to prevent any hint of scandal. He followed Miss Morgan to the front desk, where a young woman in plain, warm clothing stood nervously clutching a cloth bag. Edmund recognized her immediately, Mary Sullivan, whose husband attended the temperance meetings at the Whitechapel Mission where Edmund volunteered. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, keeping his voice low. What brings you here? Her eyes were red-rimmed, whether from tears or exhaustion he couldn't tell. I'm sorry to bother you at your work, Professor, but I didn't know where else to turn. It's Michael, he's taken bad again. Lost his position at the docks after showing up drunk, and now he's disappeared. I'm afraid he might do something desperate. Edmund glanced at Miss Morgan, who was maintaining a studiously neutral expression while clearly listening to every word. The academy was no place for this conversation. Wait for me outside, he told Mrs. Sullivan. I'll join you in a moment. After she left, Edmund turned to Miss Morgan. I must attend to this. If anyone asks dash. You're researching at the British Museum, she said smoothly. I saw you leave with your notebook not 5 minutes ago. Edmund gave her a grateful look. Thank you, Miss Morgan. We must all follow our conscience, Professor, she replied quietly. Even when it inconveniences our employers. The journey from the rarefied atmosphere of the academy to the harsh realities of Whitechapel was more than a matter of geography. It was a descent from the comfortable fiction that society told itself about progress and civilization into the raw truth of urban poverty. Edmund walked beside Mrs. Sullivan through increasingly narrow and dirty streets, the elegant townhouses giving way to cramped tenements and eventually to the rookeries where London's poorest struggled to survive. The fog was thicker here, mixed with the smoke from countless small fires and the miasma rising from inadequate sewers. The cobblestones were slick with substances Edmund preferred not to identify, and the air carried the complex bouquet of too many people living in too small a space, cooking cabbage, unwashed bodies, human waste, and underneath it all, the sweet sick smell of gin. Mrs. Sullivan led him through alleys he would never have ventured into alone, past groups of men who eyed his respectable clothes with expressions that mixed resentment with opportunistic calculation. Children played in the gutters, their games interrupted to stare at the strange gentleman in their midst. Many of them, Edmund knew, were already acquainted with gin given it by parents to quiet their hunger, or stealing sips from unguarded bottles. He's been trying so hard, Professor, Mrs. Sullivan was saying, her words coming in breathless bursts as they walked. 6 weeks without a drop. Going to the meetings regular like. Then this morning, the foreman at the dock says they don't need him anymore. Too many men, not enough work. Michael took it hard. Said what was the point of staying sober if it didn't matter anyway? Edmund understood the despair all too well. He had seen it countless times, men who struggled against their addiction only to be defeated by circumstances beyond their control. Society demanded sobriety but offered little support for achieving or maintaining it. They arrived at a building that seemed to lean against its neighbors for support, its walls stained with decades of soot and neglect. Mrs. Sullivan led him upstairs that creaked ominously under their weight, past doors behind which Edmund could hear the sounds of daily life arguments, crying children, the crash of breaking crockery. The Sullivans' room was on the 3rd floor, a single space that served as kitchen, bedroom, and living area for the family of 5. 3 children huddled on a mattress in the corner, the youngest perhaps 4 years old, all watching with wide eyes as Edmund entered. The room was clean despite its poverty, everything arranged with the careful attention of someone fighting to maintain dignity in impossible circumstances. "These are my children," Mrs. Sullivan said unnecessarily. "Thomas, Margaret, and little Annie. Children, this is Professor Whitmore, the gentleman I told you about who's been helping your father." Edmund nodded to the children, noting their thin faces and hollow eyes. The eldest, Thomas, perhaps 12 years old, stood protectively near his siblings. "When did your father leave?" Edmund asked him directly, recognizing the boy as the temporary head of household. "This morning, sir," Thomas replied. "After he got back from the docks. He didn't say nothing, just grabbed his coat and left. Mother went looking but couldn't find him." Edmund considered the situation. Michael Sullivan had 3 places he might go when despair overtook him: the public house, the Thames, a dark thought Edmund pushed away, or the opium den on Dorset Street where he'd once sought oblivion before finding the temperance movement. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need you to stay here with the children," Edmund said. "I'll search for your husband. Thomas, do you know the Blue Anchor on Commercial Street?" The boy nodded, his expression suggesting he knew it all too well. "If your father returns, send word to me there. I'll check every hour." Edmund left the cramped room and descended back to the street. The Blue Anchor was the most likely starting point. It was where Michael had done most of his drinking before taking the pledge. The public house was exactly what Edmund expected: a narrow frontage squeezed between a pawnbroker and a lodging house, its windows grimy enough to obscure the interior while still allowing the warm glow of gaslight to beckon passers-by. The smell hit him as soon as he opened the door: stale beer, tobacco smoke, sawdust soaked with various liquids, and the distinctive odor of too many unwashed bodies in too small a space. The noise was considerable, men shouting to be heard over each other, the clink of glasses, someone attempting to sing a music hall song with more enthusiasm than skill. Edmund's appearance caused a momentary lull in the conversation nearest the door. He was clearly out of place, his academic clothes marking him as surely as a sign around his neck. But London public houses saw all sorts, and after the initial curiosity, most of the patrons returned to their drinks and conversations. The proprietor, a massive man with arms like ham hocks and a face that suggested he'd settled more than a few disputes with his fists, looked Edmund up and down with professional assessment. "Lost, are you, Governor?" he asked, his tone suggesting that lost people in his establishment could become permanently so if they caused trouble. "I'm looking for Michael Sullivan," Edmund said, pitching his voice to carry authority despite his scholarly appearance. "Has he been in today?" The proprietor's eyes narrowed. "You're that Temperance fellow, aren't you? The one what's been stealing away my customers with your meetings and pledges." "I'm trying to help people who want to be helped," Edmund replied evenly. Now, about Michael Sullivan? Haven't seen him, the proprietor said, but his eyes flicked toward the back of the establishment, a tell Edmund caught. Edmund pulled out a shilling, placing it on the bar with deliberate precision. I'm not here to cause trouble. The man's family is worried. If he's here, I just want to talk to him. The proprietor palmed the coin with practiced ease. Might be someone matching that description in the back room. But you didn't hear it from me. Edmund made his way through the crowded public house, trying to breathe shallowly to minimize the assault on his senses. The back room was smaller, darker, filled with serious drinkers rather than social ones. These were men who had moved beyond conversation, focused entirely on the business of obliteration. Michael Sullivan sat in the corner, a half-empty bottle of gin before him. He looked up as Edmund approached, his eyes taking a moment to focus. "Professor," he slurred. "Come to save me, have you?" Edmund sat down across from him, the wooden chair sticky with spilled liquor. "Your wife is worried, Michael. Your children need you home." Michael laughed bitterly. "Need me? What good am I to them? Can't keep a job, can't provide. Better off without me." "That's the gin talking," Edmund said gently. "You've been sober for 6 weeks. You know you're a better man without it." "Better man," Michael repeated mockingly. "Better man got sacked just the same as the drunk. Least the drunk don't care so much." Edmund understood this logic, had heard it countless times. The pain of failure was easier to bear through the numbing haze of alcohol. But he also knew the temporary relief came at a terrible price. "Come with me, Michael," he said. "Not for me, not even for your family. Come because you've fought too hard to give up now. 6 weeks of sobriety isn't erased by one moment of weakness." Michael stared at him for a long moment, then suddenly pushed the bottle away with such force it nearly toppled. "Can't even do this right," he muttered. "Can't stay sober, can't get proper drunk. What use is a man like that?" "A man who keeps trying despite repeated failures is the most useful kind," Edmund replied. "That's called courage, Michael. And your children need to see it, to learn it from you." Slowly, unsteadily, Michael stood. Edmund supported him, feeling the man's weight against his shoulder. Together, they made their way out of the public house, ignoring the jeers and comments from other patrons. The proprietor watched them go with an expression of disgust, clearly viewing Edmund as bad for business. By the time Edmund returned to his boarding house, darkness had fully claimed London. The gas lamps created pools of yellow light that only emphasized the darkness between them, and the fog had thickened to the point where visibility was limited to a few yards. His clothes smelled of the public house and the streets of Whitechapel, and exhaustion weighed on him like a physical burden. He had successfully returned Michael Sullivan to his family, though whether the man would maintain his sobriety was an open question. The immediate crisis had passed, but Edmund knew it was only one battle in a war that would continue as long as poverty and alcohol remained intertwined in the fabric of London life. Mrs. Pemberton was waiting in the hallway when he entered, her expression disapproving. "Professor Whitmore, you've missed supper again. And you smell like, well, I won't say what you smell like, but it's not appropriate for a respectable establishment." "My apologies, Mrs. Pemberton. I was attending to someone in need." Her expression softened slightly. She knew about his temperance work, though she didn't entirely approve. In her world, the poor were poor because of moral failings, and attempting to help them was interference with divine justice. "I've kept a plate warm for you," she said, her practical nature overcoming her disapproval. "You can eat in the kitchen after you've cleaned yourself up. And Professor, there's a letter for you. Came by special delivery this evening." Edmund took the envelope she offered, recognizing the Academy's seal. His stomach, already tight with hunger, clenched further with apprehension. Special delivery letters from the Academy rarely contained good news. In his room, Edmund first attended to his ablutions, washing away the grime of Whitechapel with cold water and harsh soap. Only when he was clean and had changed into fresh clothes did he open the letter. It was from the Dean, written in his precise copperplate hand. Professor Whitmore, it has come to my attention that you were absent from the Academy this afternoon without proper authorization. Furthermore, I have received reports that you were seen entering a public house in Whitechapel, behavior entirely unbefitting a member of our faculty. Your presence is required in my office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to discuss your future at this institution. Dean Harrington. Edmund set the letter down with steady hands, though his mind raced. Someone had followed him or had him followed. The speed with which the information had reached the dean suggested a deliberate effort to monitor his activities. He wondered if it was connected to Lord Pemberton's anger about his son's wine cellar incident, or if there were other forces working against him. He made his way down to the kitchen, where Mrs. Pemberton had indeed kept a plate-warm boiled beef, potatoes, and carrots, simple fare but nourishing. He ate mechanically, his mind already preparing arguments for tomorrow's confrontation with the dean. Trouble at the Academy? Mrs. Pemberton asked, bustling about the kitchen with the restless energy that kept her moving from dawn to dusk. Perhaps, Edmund admitted. My work with the temperance movement is not universally appreciated. She sniffed. Well, I won't say I entirely approve of all this teetotal business, a little wine for the stomach's sake, as the good book says, but you're a decent man, Professor. More decent than most who claim respectability. It was high praise from Mrs. Pemberton, and Edmund was touched. Thank you. That means a great deal. After his meal, Edmund retired to his room to prepare for the next day's confrontation. He pulled out his employment contract, studying the terms and conditions. The endowment from Lady Worthington was specific. The Academy must maintain a lecturer in temperance, but it didn't specify that it had to be him. If the dean wanted him gone badly enough, he could find a replacement, perhaps someone who would teach temperance as a historical curiosity rather than a living cause. Edmund spent several hours writing and rewriting his defense, marshalling arguments about academic freedom, the importance of practical application of moral philosophy, and the social value of his work. But he knew that logic and reason might not be enough. The Academy, for all its pretensions to intellectual rigor, was ultimately a political institution, dependent on the goodwill of its benefactors. As the bells of St. Margaret's chimed 11, Edmund set aside his papers and prepared for bed. Whatever tomorrow brought, he would face it with dignity and conviction. He knelt beside his bed for his evening prayers, asking not for victory but for strength to bear whatever trials awaited. Sleep came slowly, his mind replaying the day's events and anticipating tomorrow's challenges. Through the thin walls, he could hear the sounds of the boarding house settling for the night, footsteps on creaking floorboards, the distant murmur of voices, someone coughing persistently in the room above. The morning came too quickly, announced by the bells of St. Margaret's. Edmund rose and prepared himself with extra care, knowing that appearance would play a role in the day's proceedings. His best shirt, carefully pressed the night before. His academic gown, brushed free of any lint or dust. His shoes polished to a military shine. Mrs. Pemberton had breakfast ready early, seeming to sense the importance of the day. Eat properly, she commanded, setting before him a full plate of eggs, bacon, and toast. Whatever battle you're facing, you'll need strength for it. Edmund ate, though anxiety had robbed him of appetite. The food sat heavy in his stomach as he made his way through the foggy streets to the Academy. This morning, the familiar route felt like a path to judgment, each step bringing him closer to what might be the end of his academic career. Jenkins was at his post, his expression carefully neutral, though Edmund thought he detected a hint of sympathy in the old soldier's eyes. "The dean's waiting for you, Professor," he said simply. The walk to the dean's office seemed both endless and too brief. Edmund knocked at precisely 8 o'clock, hearing the bells chime as his knuckles struck the wood. "Enter." The office was fuller than Edmund had expected. Dean Harrington sat behind his desk, but he was not alone. Lord Pemberton was there, his florid face set in lines of disapproval. Also present was Mr. Josiah Worthington, nephew of Edmund's benefactress, and, surprisingly, Miss Morgan from the library. "Professor Whitmore," the dean began without preamble, "these are serious charges against you. Abandoning your teaching duties to frequent public houses in the worst parts of London. Is this the example we want set for our students?" "I was not frequenting a public house," Edmund said calmly. "I was retrieving a man who had fallen back into drink after losing his employment. His family came to me for help." Lord Pemberton snorted. "And this is appropriate work for an academy professor? Consorting with drunkards and their wives? With respect, Lord Pemberton, helping those struggling with alcohol addiction is entirely consistent with my role as a lecturer in temperance. How can I teach about the dangers of drink without understanding and addressing its real-world consequences?" "You can teach from books and established curriculum," the dean said. "Not by dragging the academy's reputation through the gutters of Whitechapel." Edmund felt his temper rising but kept it in check. "The academy's charter speaks of moral education and social improvement. How is practical charity work not aligned with these goals?" "Because," Mr. Worthington interjected, "your charity work is alienating the very families who support this institution. My aunt may have endowed your position, but the academy cannot survive on one benefactor alone." Edmund turned to face him directly. "Your aunt believed that temperance was essential to social progress. She would be appalled to know that her nephew was working to undermine her legacy." Worthington's face reddened. "How dare you presume to speak for my aunt?" "I speak for her stated wishes, expressed clearly in her endowment," Edmund replied. "She wanted temperance taught as a living principle, not a dead letter." Miss Morgan, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke. "May I contribute to this discussion?" The dean looked surprised. "Miss Morgan, you're here as a witness to Professor Whitmore's absence yesterday, not as a participant in these proceedings." "Nevertheless," she continued with quiet determination, "I believe I have relevant information. I have been researching the terms of Lady Worthington's endowment, and they are quite specific. The temperance lectureship must be maintained, and the lecturer must be given full freedom to pursue both academic and practical applications of temperance principles." Those are her exact words. The dean's expression tightened. "Be that as it may dash." "Furthermore," Miss Morgan continued, producing a document from the folder she carried, "I have here a letter from Lady Worthington to the previous dean, expressing her hope that the temperance lecturer would engage with London's working classes, bringing education and support to those most affected by alcohol." The room fell silent. Edmund looked at Miss Morgan with surprise and gratitude. She had clearly spent considerable time preparing this defense. Lord Pemberton broke the silence. "Regardless of what some old woman wanted, we must deal with present realities. My son has become a social embarrassment, refusing wine at dinner parties, lecturing his peers about the evils of drink. This is Whitmore's influence, and it's intolerable. Your son," Edmund said carefully, "is a young man of principle who has made his own decisions based on education and evidence. Would you prefer he remain ignorant?" "I would prefer," Lord Pemberton said coldly, "that he behave like a gentleman rather than a Methodist preacher." The dean raised his hand for silence. Gentlemen, and Miss Morgan, we must find a compromise. Professor Whitmore, you will continue in your position, but with strict conditions. No more unauthorized absences. No more direct intervention in the lives of the working classes. You may teach your courses and hold your seminars, but your activism must cease. Edmund felt the familiar weight of institutional pressure. He could accept and continue his work in a limited capacity, or refuse and lose his platform entirely. I need time to consider, he said. You have until end of day, the dean replied. Submit your decision in writing. Edmund left the dean's office feeling both reprieved and trapped. He had not been dismissed outright, but the conditions placed upon him would essentially neuter his work. Teaching temperance without practicing it, without demonstrating its real-world application, would make him a hypocrite. Instead of going to his lecture hall, Edmund found himself walking, letting his feet carry him while his mind grappled with the choice before him. The fog had lifted somewhat, revealing a London morning in all its contradictory glory, elegant squares and squalid alleys, prosperity and poverty existing side by side. He found himself at Hyde Park, where nursemaids pushed perambulators along the paths and elderly gentlemen fed the ducks on the Serpentine. The peaceful scene stood in stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind. A bench beckoned, and Edmund sat, watching the world go by while he considered his options. Professor Whitmore? Edmund looked up to see Thomas Ashford, his scholarship student, approaching hesitantly. Mr. Ashford. Shouldn't you be in lectures? Thomas colored slightly. I heard about this morning's meeting, sir. The whole academy's talking about it. I wanted to, that is, I hope to express my support. Edmund was touched. That's kind of you, Mr. Ashford, but you shouldn't jeopardize your own position for my sake. With respect, sir, you've taught us that principles matter more than position. How can I claim to believe in temperance if I'm not willing to stand for it? The young man's words struck Edmund forcefully. Here was the fruit of his teaching, not just knowledge imparted, but courage inspired. Tell me, Mr. Ashford, Edmund said, if you had to choose between a comfortable position that required you to compromise your beliefs and an uncertain future that allowed you to maintain them, what would you choose? Thomas didn't hesitate. The uncertain future, sir. Comfort built on compromise is no comfort at all. From the mouths of babes, Edmund thought. Or at least, from the mouths of idealistic young men who hadn't yet felt the full weight of the world's pressures. They were interrupted by the arrival of another figure, Miss Morgan, slightly out of breath from hurrying. Professor Whitmore, forgive the intrusion. I saw you leave and thought, well, I wanted to apologize if my intervention this morning caused more harm than good. On the contrary, Miss Morgan, your defense was both unexpected and deeply appreciated. She sat on the bench, maintaining proper distance but clearly determined to speak her mind. I've been thinking about your situation. What if there were a third option? Edmund raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. The Worthington Endowment specifies that the Academy must maintain a temperance lecturer, but it doesn't specify the exact nature of the position. What if you were to propose a new structure, one that officially separates your academic work from your practical application, while maintaining both? Go on. Miss Morgan pulled out a small notebook, consulting her neat handwriting. You could teach your regular courses at the Academy, fulfilling your contractual obligations. But you could also establish an independent temperance institute, supported by separate funding. The two would be officially distinct but practically connected. It was an elegant solution, Edmund had to admit. But where would such funding come from? There are sympathetic benefactors, Miss Morgan said. The Quaker community has resources and shares your concerns about alcohol. Several Methodist congregations might contribute. And she hesitated, then continued, I have a small inheritance from my grandmother. It's not much, but it could help establish the institute. Edmund was stunned. Miss Morgan, I couldn't possibly accept Dash. You could and you should, she interrupted, showing more fire than he'd ever seen from her. This work matters. It changes lives. I've seen the students you've influenced, the families you've helped. That's worth more than money sitting in a bank. Thomas Ashford leaned forward eagerly. I could help too, Professor. I may not have money, but I have time and energy. I could teach basic literacy at the Institute. Many of the working men can't read the temperance literature even if they want to. Edmund felt something shifting inside him, like ice breaking up on a frozen river. Here were allies he hadn't expected, support from quarters he hadn't anticipated. It would be a risk, he said slowly. The dean would not be pleased if he saw it as circumventing his authority. But it would be legal, Miss Morgan pointed out. What you do in your own time, with your own resources, is not the Academy's concern. As long as you fulfill your teaching obligations and don't explicitly connect the two institutions, they have no grounds for complaint. Edmund stood, his decision crystallizing. Then I shall need to draft 2 letters, one to the dean accepting his conditions, and one to potential benefactors outlining our vision for an independent temperance institute. Our vision? Miss Morgan asked with a small smile. I can hardly do this alone, Edmund replied. If you're willing to risk your inheritance, the least I can do is make you a founding partner in the enterprise. The letter to Dean Harrington was simple and formal. Dear Dean Harrington, after careful consideration, I accept the conditions placed upon my continued employment at the Royal Academy. I shall fulfill my teaching obligations without unauthorized absences and will ensure that my academic work remains separate from any external activities. Yours respectfully, Professor Edmund Whitmore. The dean's response came within hours, a terse acknowledgment that made clear his suspicion but admitted he had no grounds for complaint. The second letter, copies of which were sent to various potential benefactors, was more complex and heartfelt. Dear friends of social progress, I write to propose the establishment of an independent institute dedicated to temperance education and support for those struggling with alcohol addiction. This institute would operate separately from any academic institution, providing practical assistance to working families affected by drink while also conducting research into the most effective methods of prevention and treatment. The need is urgent. In London alone, thousands of families suffer from the effects of alcohol abuse. Children go hungry because fathers drink their wages. Women endure violence from intoxicated husbands. Men of promise are reduced to degradation by their addiction. Yet there is hope. I have seen men reclaim their lives through education and support. I have witnessed families reunited, children fed and educated, when the curse of drink is lifted. This institute would systematize and expand such work. We seek modest funding to rent premises, provide basic education materials, and support those in the crucial early days of sobriety. Any contribution, no matter how small, would be deeply appreciated. Yours in the cause of human progress, Professor Edmund Whitmore. The response exceeded Edmund's most optimistic expectations. Within a week, pledges of support arrived from unexpected sources. A Quaker merchant offered the use of a building in Clerkenwell, rent-free for the first year. A Methodist congregation pledged monthly support. Most surprisingly, an anonymous benefactor sent a substantial check with a note saying only, from one who has seen the ravages of drink and wishes to prevent others' suffering. Miss Morgan proved to be an exceptional organizer. Within a fortnight, she had established a basic administrative structure, recruited volunteers from among Edmund's students and begun planning a program of lectures and support meetings. The building in Clerkenwell was modest, a former warehouse with large, open rooms that could be configured for different purposes. But it was clean, dry, and accessible to the working-class neighborhoods where help was most needed. On a gray Thursday morning in October, Edmund stood in what would become the main lecture hall of the London Temperance Institute. Wooden benches had been arranged in rows. A simple podium constructed by Thomas Ashford and other volunteers stood at the front. The walls were bare except for a single banner reading knowledge, support, hope. "It's not much," Miss Morgan said, standing beside him, "but it's a beginning." "All great movements start small," Edmund replied. "What matters is not the size of the seed but the quality of the soil and the dedication of the gardeners." That evening, they held their first public meeting. Edmund had expected perhaps a dozen attendees. Instead, nearly 50 people crowded into the room, working men still in their laborers' clothes, women with children in their arms, a few middle-class reformers, and surprisingly, several of his students from the academy. Edmund began simply. "Welcome to the London Temperance Institute. We are here not to judge or condemn, but to educate and support. Alcohol addiction is not a moral failing but a condition that can be understood and overcome. Together, we can break its hold on our lives and our communities." What followed was unlike any lecture he had given at the academy. People shared their stories, men who had lost jobs, women who had endured abuse, children who had gone hungry. But also stories of hope, days, weeks, months of sobriety achieved and maintained. Michael Sullivan was there, 6 days sober again, his wife beside him. He stood and spoke haltingly about his struggles, about the temptation that never quite went away but could be managed with support and purpose. As Edmund listened to these testimonies, he realized that this was what had been missing from his academic work, the human element, the lived experience that transformed abstract principles into breathing reality. As autumn gave way to winter, the London Temperance Institute faced its first real challenges. The initial enthusiasm that had packed the lecture hall began to wane as the reality of maintaining sobriety in a society saturated with alcohol became apparent. The weather turned bitter in November, with freezing fog that seemed to penetrate even the thickest coat. The Institute's heating was minimal, a single coal stove that barely warmed the large room. Edmund often conducted meetings while able to see his breath, and attendance dropped as people chose the warm comfort of public houses over the cold virtue of temperance meetings. One particularly harsh evening, only 7 people attended the scheduled lecture. Edmund stood at the podium, looking at the empty benches, and felt the weight of potential failure. Miss Morgan, ever present and supportive, sat in the front row with her notebook, prepared to take minutes for a meeting that seemed hardly worth conducting. "Perhaps we should cancel," Edmund suggested, his voice echoing in the nearly empty hall. "No," said a firm voice from the back. Mrs. Sullivan had arrived late, snow still clinging to her shawl. "Even if it's just us, we need this. The public house is warm and full, Professor." "That's exactly why we need to be here." Edmund nodded, humbled by her determination. He gave his lecture on the physiological effects of alcohol on the nervous system with the same care he would have given to a packed hall. The 7 attendees listened intently, asked questions, engaged in discussion. It was, in its way, more rewarding than lecturing to hundreds of disinterested academy students. But financial pressures mounted. The anonymous benefactor's contribution had covered initial expenses, but ongoing costs, coal for heating, gas for lighting, printed materials, quickly depleted their resources. Miss Morgan's inheritance, which she had generously contributed, was not infinite. Edmund found himself making difficult choices. He reduced his already modest personal expenses, eating only 1 meal a day, walking instead of taking omnibuses, wearing his shirts an extra day to save on laundry costs. The money saved went directly to the institute. At the academy, his situation was increasingly awkward. While he fulfilled his teaching obligations scrupulously, his colleagues were aware of his evening activities. Some, like Dr. Bellingham, expressed quiet support. Others viewed him with suspicion or contempt. Lord Pemberton had not forgotten or forgiven Edmund's influence on his son. Young James Pemberton remained committed to temperance, much to his father's fury. The young man had even begun volunteering at the institute, teaching reading to working men, an activity his father considered beneath the dignity of their social position. One afternoon in early December, Edmund was summoned once again to Dean Harrington's office. This time, the summons came not through Jenkins but via Lord Pemberton himself, who appeared at Edmund's lecture hall door with barely concealed satisfaction. "The Dean requires your immediate presence," Lord Pemberton said, his tone suggesting Christmas had come early for him. Edmund found the Dean's office occupied once again by a small tribunal. This time, however, there was a new face, a distinguished elderly gentleman whom Edmund recognized as Sir Reginald Worthington, elder brother of Edmund's deceased benefactress and patriarch of the Worthington family. "Professor Whitmore," Sir Reginald said before the Dean could speak, "I've been hearing interesting things about your work. My nephew Josiah tells me you've established some sort of independent institute, despite agreeing to cease your activism." Edmund chose his words carefully. "I have established an institute that operates entirely separately from my academy work, Sir Reginald. I fulfill all my obligations here and conduct other activities on my own time." "Semantics," Lord Pemberton spat. "He's using his position at the academy to recruit volunteers and attendees for his temperance crusade." "I have never used class time to recruit anyone," Edmund replied firmly. "If students choose to volunteer of their own accord, that is their decision as free individuals." Sir Reginald studied Edmund with sharp eyes that belied his advanced age. "Tell me, Professor, what would my sister have thought of your institute?" It was a crucial question, Edmund realized. Sir Reginald controlled the family fortune and could influence the continuation of the endowment. "I believe Lady Worthington would have heartily approved," Edmund said. "She believed in practical charity as well as academic education. The institute embodies both principles." "My sister was a foolish woman with romantic notions about social reform," Sir Reginald said dismissively. "However, her will is quite specific about the endowment. As long as the academy maintains a temperance lecturer who fulfills his duties, the money continues." He stood, using a silver-headed cane for support. "Professor Whitmore, you walk a fine line. Continue to walk it carefully. Dean Harrington, Lord Pemberton, I see no grounds for action here. The man is doing his job, albeit with what some might consider excessive enthusiasm. Good day, gentlemen." His departure left a tense silence. The Dean's frustration was evident, Lord Pemberton's anger palpable. "You may have won this round, Whitmore," Lord Pemberton said quietly, "but don't think this is over. Men like you, with your rigid morality and judgment of your betters, you're relics of a dying age. Progress will sweep you away." "Perhaps," Edmund replied. "But until it does, I will continue to teach truth and help those who seek it." The winter solstice brought the longest night of the year, and with it, a crisis that would test the Institute's resolve. Thomas Ashford arrived at Edmund's boarding house late in the evening, his face pale with concern. "Professor, you must come quickly. There's been an incident at the Institute." Edmund grabbed his coat and followed Thomas through the icy streets. As they approached the building in Clerkenwell, Edmund could see a crowd gathered outside, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Several police constables were present, their bullseye lanterns casting harsh light on the scene. The Institute's windows had been smashed, glass scattered across the floor inside. Furniture was overturned, and the banner reading knowledge, support, hope had been torn down and defaced with obscene graffiti. Who did this? Edmund asked the senior constable, a man whose weary expression suggested he'd seen too many such scenes. Local publicans, most likely, the constable replied. You've been bad for business, Professor. The Blue Anchor alone reports a 20% drop in customs since your institute opened. Men who used to drink their wages are taking them home instead. That makes enemies. Edmund surveyed the damage, his heart heavy. Months of work, destroyed in minutes. Several of the Institute's regular attendees had arrived, including Michael Sullivan and his family. They stood in shocked silence, seeing their refuge violated. We can't meet here tonight, Edmund said, stating the obvious. Then we meet elsewhere, Mrs. Sullivan said firmly. Our flat's too small, but Mrs. O'Brien has a larger place. We could gather there. Or, Miss Morgan said, appearing from the crowd with her usual quiet efficiency, we could use this opportunity to demonstrate our resilience. The damage is mainly to windows and furniture. The structure is sound. If we work together, we could clear the debris and hold our meeting as scheduled. Edmund looked at the gathered crowd, working men and women who had walked through the cold night to attend a temperance meeting, only to find destruction. Their faces showed disappointment but also, increasingly, determination. Miss Morgan is right, Edmund said, raising his voice to address the crowd. This destruction is meant to intimidate us, to drive us away. But we are stronger than glass windows and wooden benches. If you're willing, we can clear this space and hold our meeting. We'll stand if we must, we'll endure the cold, but we will not be silenced. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Without further prompting, people began picking up glass, carefully wrapping the larger shards in newspaper. The overturned benches were righted, broken ones set aside. Someone produced a broom and began sweeping. The constable watched with apparent surprise. You're really going to stay? We are, Edmund confirmed. Though I would appreciate if one of your men could remain, in case there's further trouble. The constable nodded slowly. I'll stay myself. Haven't seen spirit like this in a while. Makes a change from breaking up drunken brawls. Within an hour, the worst of the damage had been cleared. The broken windows let in the bitter December air, but someone had brought spare blankets from home, hanging them over the gaps. It wasn't perfect, but it provided some barrier against the cold. Candles were lit to supplement the gas lamps, creating a softer, almost sacred atmosphere. More people arrived as news of the vandalism spread through the neighborhood. Some came out of curiosity, others in solidarity. By the time Edmund stood to begin the meeting, the hall was fuller than it had been in weeks. Tonight, Edmund began, his breath visible in the cold air, we have been given a gift. A murmur of surprise ran through the crowd. Not the gift of destruction, he continued, but the gift of revelation. We have seen that our work here threatens those who profit from human misery. We have seen that when we stand together, we can overcome violence with peace, destruction with construction, hate with determination. He paused, looking at the faces before him, working men with calloused hands, women worn by hardship, children who should have been in bed but whose parents had nowhere else to leave them. These were not the comfortable intellectuals of the academy, but people for whom temperance was not an abstract principle but a daily struggle for survival. The publicans who did this, Edmund said, are not our true enemies. They too are trapped in a system that profits from addiction. Our enemy is ignorance, ignorance of alcohol's effects, ignorance of alternatives to the public house, ignorance of our own strength when we support each other. Old Mr. O'Malley, a dock worker who had been sober for 3 months, stood up. Professor's right. I spent 20 years making the publican rich while my family went hungry. No broken window is going to send me back to that. Others began to speak testimonies of days sober, of families reunited, of dignity reclaimed. The cold room warmed with shared purpose and mutual support. Even the constable, still standing by the door, seemed moved by the proceedings. Miss Morgan had been taking notes, as always, but she set down her pen and stood. I propose we establish a restoration fund. Not just to repair the windows, but to improve the Institute. To show that every attack makes us stronger. I can contribute a day's wages, someone called out. I'll give what I was going to spend at the public house this week, another added. Edmund felt tears prick his eyes as pledges came from people who had almost nothing to give. These were not wealthy benefactors writing checks from their surplus, but working people sacrificing necessities to support something they believed in. By Christmas week, the London Temperance Institute had not only recovered from the vandalism but emerged stronger. The broken windows had been replaced with thicker glass, paid for by the spontaneous collection. More significantly, the attack had generated sympathetic coverage in several newspapers, bringing new supporters and volunteers. Edmund stood in his room at Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house on Christmas Eve, preparing for what would be his last day of teaching at the academy before the holiday break. His wardrobe held the same worn suits, his desk the same careful notes, but something fundamental had changed. He no longer felt like a man caught between two worlds, but someone who had found his true calling. A knock at his door interrupted his preparations. Mrs. Pemberton entered with an unusually gentle expression. "Professor, there's someone to see you." "A lady." "I've put her in the parlor." Edmund descended to find an elderly woman, dressed in expensive but understated clothing, sitting perfectly upright in one of Mrs. Pemberton's antimacassar-covered chairs. She looked familiar, though Edmund couldn't immediately place her. "Professor Whitmore," she said, her voice cultured but warm. "I am Lady Constance Worthington. I believe you knew my sister-in-law, Lady Margaret, Edmund's benefactress." He bowed slightly. Lady Worthington was a great supporter of temperance education. Her loss is still felt. "Indeed. Which is why I'm here." Lady Constance studied him with intelligent eyes. "I have been following your work, both at the Academy and at your independent institute. My nephew Josiah disapproves, of course, as does my husband. But I have my own money, Professor, left to me by my father, and I may dispose of it as I wish." She opened her reticule and withdrew an envelope. "This is a banker's draft for a sum that should sustain your institute for the next year. There will be more if you use it wisely." Edmund was speechless. The amount on the draft was more than he earned in 2 years at the Academy. "Lady Worthington, I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," she replied, rising with the aid of an ivory-handled cane. "Simply continue your work. My sister-in-law believed in you, Professor, and having investigated thoroughly, I see why. You are that rarest of creatures, a man who lives his principles." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Professor? My husband and nephew need not know about this arrangement. I'm officially donating to various charitable causes. What could be more charitable than saving men from the slavery of drink?" After she left, Edmund sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Pemberton, who had undoubtedly been listening at the door, entered with a tea tray. "Well," she said, setting down the china with a satisfied air, "it seems your work is appreciated in unexpected quarters." "It seems so," Edmund agreed, still processing this reversal of fortune. "You'll be staying on then? Not leaving us for grander accommodations?" Edmund smiled. "Mrs. Pemberton, your boarding house has been my home through difficult times. I wouldn't dream of leaving now that circumstances have improved." She sniffed, but he could see she was pleased. "Well then, drink your tea while it's hot. You've got teaching to do today, haven't you?" The academy felt different as Edmund walked through its halls that morning. Not the building itself, the same portraits gazed down, the same marble echoed under his feet, but his relationship to it had changed. He no longer needed this position for survival. He could teach here because he chose to, not because he had to. His morning lecture was sparsely attended, many students having already departed for the Christmas holiday. But those present seemed more engaged than usual. James Pemberton was there, of course, and Thomas Ashford, but also several new faces, young men who had heard about the Institute and wanted to learn more. Edmund taught with renewed passion, freed from the constant worry about offending the administration. He spoke about the social cost of alcoholism, the medical evidence of its harms, the moral imperative to address this crisis. When a student challenged him, "Surely, Professor, a glass of wine at Christmas does no harm," Edmund responded with nuance rather than dogma. "For many people, moderate consumption may indeed be harmless," he said. "But for others, that single glass awakens a craving that can destroy lives." We must be aware of our own vulnerabilities and compassionate toward those whose struggles differ from our own. After the lecture, Thomas Ashford approached him. "Professor, I've been thinking about my future. I want to continue this work, perhaps establish institutes in other cities. Would you consider taking me on as an assistant at the Institute? I could defer my final year at the Academy." Edmund was touched but cautious. "Your education is important, Thomas. Don't sacrifice your future for immediate purpose." "With respect, sir, I believe this is my education. What use is philosophy without application? What good is knowledge without service?" It was an echo of Edmund's own journey, and he recognized the conviction in the young man's eyes. "Complete your degree," Edmund advised. "But you may assist at the Institute in your free time. When you graduate, we'll discuss a formal position." Winter gradually released its grip on London, and with the arrival of spring 1906, the London Temperance Institute had become a fixture in Clerkenwell. The evening meetings regularly drew 50 or more attendees, and afternoon sessions had been added for women who couldn't attend evening gatherings. Edmund's daily routine had evolved into a satisfying rhythm. Mornings at the Academy, teaching with renewed purpose. Afternoons at the Institute, preparing materials and meeting with individuals struggling with sobriety. Evenings leading meetings or visiting families in need. The financial security provided by Lady Constance's donation had allowed for significant improvements. The Institute now had proper heating, comfortable seating, and a small library of temperance literature and general educational materials. Thomas Ashford had established a reading room where working men could find newspapers and improving books, an alternative to the public house for their leisure hours. Miss Morgan had proven invaluable, her organizational skills keeping the Institute running smoothly. She had also revealed unexpected depths, establishing a women's support group that addressed not just temperance but the broader challenges faced by working-class women. One mild April evening, Edmund stood at the podium preparing to address a particularly full meeting. The audience included many familiar faces: Michael Sullivan, now 4 months sober and employed again at the docks; Mrs. O'Brien, whose husband had taken the pledge after seeing the changes in his neighbors; young James Pemberton, who despite his father's continued disapproval, remained committed to the cause. But there were also unexpected attendees. Dr. Bellingham from the Academy sat in the back row, his presence a surprise. Near him, Edmund spotted the constable who had stayed during the night of vandalism, now attending out of interest rather than duty. "Friends," Edmund began, his voice carrying the quiet authority earned through months of practical work. 6 months ago, this institute began with a simple premise that education and support could break the grip of alcohol addiction. Tonight, I look out and see the proof of that premise. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But we must not become complacent. For every person here who has found freedom from drink, dozens more remain enslaved. For every family reunited, scores remain broken. Our work has barely begun. What more can we do, Professor? Called out Mrs. Sullivan. We're just working people. We don't have power or influence. You have the greatest power of all, Edmund replied. The power of example. Every day you maintain your sobriety, you prove it's possible. Every person you support through their struggles, you weaken alcohol's hold on our community. Dr. Bellingham stood, surprising everyone. If I may, Professor Whitmore? Edmund nodded, curious about what his colleague would say. I came here tonight as an observer, Bellingham said, his cultured voice contrasting with the working-class accents that usually filled the hall. But I find myself compelled to participate. Professor Whitmore speaks of the power of example. Well, let me provide one. I am reducing my own alcohol consumption, not because I'm addicted, but because I've seen the truth in what's taught here. If those of us with privilege refuse to examine our own habits, how can we expect change from those with fewer resources? His words caused a stir. It was one thing for working people to embrace temperance out of necessity, quite another for a gentleman to do so by choice. The meeting continued with unusual energy. Plans were made for a summer festival, a temperance celebration to show that sobriety didn't mean joylessness. Someone suggested establishing a cooperative store where families could purchase goods without the temptation of the public house. Another proposed a children's program teaching the next generation about the dangers of drink before addiction could take hold. As the meeting concluded and people began dispersing, Edmund found himself in conversation with Dr. Bellingham. I must confess, Bellingham said, I initially thought your work quixotic. But seeing the results, the changed lives, I recognize I was wrong. What you're doing here is more valuable than half the lectures given at the academy. Both have their place, Edmund replied diplomatically, though he privately agreed. Perhaps. But I wonder if you might consider documenting your methods more formally. The medical and social science communities would benefit from understanding your approach. It was an intriguing suggestion. Edmund had been so focused on practical work that he neglected the academic potential of his experiences. I could assist, Miss Morgan offered, having overheard. We have detailed records of attendance, success rates, relapse patterns. It could make a significant contribution to the literature. Edmund felt a spark of excitement. This could bridge his two worlds, practical temperance work and academic scholarship. The Summer Temperance Festival, held on a brilliant Saturday in July, exceeded everyone's expectations. Victoria Park had been secured for the event, and hundreds attended, not just institute regulars but curious locals, supportive clergy, and even a few brave souls from the academy. Stalls offered lemonade and ginger beer, demonstrating that refreshment didn't require alcohol. Games and competitions provided entertainment, sack races for the children, a brass band concert, even a temperance pledge booth where people could publicly commit to sobriety. Edmund moved through the crowd, marveling at the transformation in people he'd known since winter. Michael Sullivan supervised a coconut shy, his children helping eagerly, their faces bright with health and happiness. Mrs. O'Brien sold homemade cakes at a stall, the proceeds going to the Institute's expansion fund. Professor Whitmore. Edmund turned to find an unexpected visitor, Dean Harrington, accompanied by his wife, a formidable woman known for her charitable work. Dean, Edmund said carefully. I didn't expect to see you here. My wife insisted, the dean replied, his tone suggesting this was not his choice. She's interested in your work with women and families. Mrs. Harrington extended her hand. Professor, I've heard remarkable things about your institute. The transformation in some of these families is quite extraordinary. The credit belongs to the people themselves, Edmund replied. We merely provide support and education. Modesty is admirable, Professor, but don't undersell your achievement, she said. You've created something unique here, a bridge between classes, a practical application of moral philosophy. My husband's academy could learn from this. The dean's expression suggested he didn't appreciate his wife's commentary, but he remained silent. As they moved on, Edmund reflected on how much had changed since that cold morning when the dean had threatened his position. The institute's success had made him, if not untouchable, at least difficult to dismiss without controversy. The festival's highlight was the testimonial session, where volunteers shared their stories. Edmund had worried this might be too serious for a celebratory event, but the organizers had insisted. One by one, people stood and spoke. A docker talked about being able to buy his children shoes because he no longer drank his wages. A woman described the return of peace to her home since her husband took the pledge. Most powerfully, young Thomas Ashford read a letter from his father in Yorkshire, thanking the Institute for helping his son become a man of principle. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Edmund stood with Miss Morgan and Thomas Ashford, watching families pack up their picnics and games. We did it, Thomas said, his voice full of wonder. We really did it. We began it, Edmund corrected gently. The work continues tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Temperance isn't a destination but a daily journey. Miss Morgan consulted her ever-present notebook. Speaking of tomorrow, we have 3 new volunteer teachers starting, the reading room needs reorganizing, and there's a family in Bethnal Green requesting assistance. Edmund smiled. Her practical focus was a perfect counterbalance to his philosophical tendencies. Then we'd better rest well tonight, he said. Tomorrow promises to be busy. October arrived again, a full year since the Institute's founding. Edmund sat in his room at Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house, writing by lamplight. The manuscript before him was nearly complete. Practical Temperance, a year of community transformation documenting the Institute's methods and results. The work had attracted attention from reformers across Britain and even internationally. Letters arrived weekly from people wanting to establish similar institutes in Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, even New York and Chicago. A soft knock interrupted his writing. Come in, he called. Mrs. Pemberton entered with a tea tray, her nightly ritual that had evolved from suspicion to support. Still writing, Professor? She asked, setting down the china with practiced ease. Nearly finished, he replied, accepting the cup gratefully. Dr. Bellingham believes the Royal Society might publish it. Well, I should think so, she said with satisfaction. After all you've accomplished. She paused at the door. You know, Professor, when you first arrived here, I thought you were too rigid, too serious. But I've watched you these 3 years. You've never wavered, never compromised your principles, but you've also learned to bend without breaking. That's a rare thing. After she left, Edmund returned to his writing, but his mind wandered to the journey that had brought him here. The struggles with the Academy administration, the nights of doubt, the small victories and major setbacks all had led to this moment of quiet satisfaction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Lord Pemberton continued his opposition, though his son James had become one of the Institute's most effective advocates. The dean maintained his cold disapproval, though Edmund's position was now secure thanks to the Institute's reputation and Lady Constance's continued support. Most importantly, every day brought new people seeking freedom from alcohol's grip, each with their own story of struggle and hope. Edmund dipped his pen in ink and continued writing. The work of temperance is never complete. Each generation must learn anew the dangers of alcohol and the power of sobriety. But if this year has taught me anything, it is that change is possible. Not through judgment or condemnation, but through education, support, and the recognition that every person struggling with drink is someone's father, mother, child, or friend. They deserve not our scorn but our compassion, not our abandonment but our assistance. The London Temperance Institute stands as proof that ordinary people, working together with extraordinary dedication, can transform their communities. We have not eliminated the curse of drink that may be beyond any single organization's power, but we have lit a candle in the darkness. And sometimes, a single candle is enough to show the way. He set down his pen and looked out the window at the gaslit streets of London. Somewhere out there, in public houses and gin palaces, people were drowning their sorrows and wages in alcohol. But somewhere else, in modest flats and boarding houses, families were sitting down to supper purchased with money that once went to drink. Children were being read to by sober parents. Men and women were facing their problems with clear heads and supportive communities. The bells of St. Margaret's chimed 10 o'clock, their bronze voices carrying through the autumn night as they had that morning a year ago when this journey intensified. Edmund prepared for bed with his usual methodical care, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities. As he knelt for his evening prayers, he gave thanks for the journey, for the allies who had appeared when needed, for the strength to persevere when the path seemed impossible. He prayed for those still struggling, for those who would seek help tomorrow, for the continuation of the work that had become his life's purpose. The last thing he heard before sleep claimed him was the distant sound of footsteps on cobblestones, perhaps someone walking home from a temperance meeting, choosing sobriety for another day. It was, Edmund thought as consciousness faded, the most beautiful sound in London. The work would continue tomorrow. Tonight, there was peace in knowing that somewhere in this great city, lives were being reclaimed, families restored, futures rewritten. The permanent history of temperance lecturers in the Edwardian Royal Academy would record Edmund Whitmore as a minor figure, a footnote in institutional history. But in the homes and hearts of those he had helped, his legacy would live on through generations freed from the bondage of drink. And that, Edmund knew as sleep finally took him, was worth more than all the academic accolades in the world. The quiet crusade would continue, one day, one person, one family at a time, until the dawn of a better tomorrow.